we work quite a lot with technology in what we do. We like to think that we don't really wear it on our sleeve very much, but it's almost always there in some form in most of the work that we make. Now, I don't think really that we make work that is specifically about technology as such, but we do definitely make, as other guys have said, work that is about stories and communication and talking. The seeds of a lot of our ideas come from a lot of different impulses, but I'm going to try and talk about mainly how we kind of try and weave digital things through that. We like to say, and generally this is almost always true, but not always, that we let the idea do the work and that we introduce the technology after. So we like to think that we always work out what it is that we want to do, and then we ask how we're going to do that. And I think, again, this is in part because I don't think that we've ever made, or at least not set out with the intention of making a work that is explicitly about the technology that we're using. We like to think that we use it to serve our purpose rather than serve or interrogate the properties of the thing itself. We're often interested in following the development of new technology, and I tend to do a lot of the core tech design stuff within the company and the implementation of it, the actual nuts and bolts of it. I started from a childhood desire to be an actor and enjoy being on the stage, and followed that through to university, and that sort of shifted towards wanting to direct theatre and devising, and a very brief, ill-thought-out foray into physical theatre, and then meandered a little bit more, and we ended up where we are now, where I find myself getting very excited about the possibilities offered by an online MySQL database. Now, I'm only describing that journey not because I think that's of interest to anyone but me particularly, but I think it's very illustrative of our relationship to technology as a company. It's kind of an evolution of a practice that we've sort of grown into, and there is definitely one way that you could look at us and you could think that what we do is very technology heavy. But I think what we're really always trying to do really is in some way trying to make you take part in telling them a story. There's the odd times that we do stumble upon something quite cool and we get a bit excited and carried away, and we think, wouldn't it be great to make a piece of work like that? And one of the main ones was a piece of augmented reality. We did a very small piece in Leeds, right there called Rear Window, where we covered a junction box in a vinyl wrap of the town, and we used a augmented reality toolkit developed by some guys in Germany called Matteo, who very kindly given us €15,000 worth of free developer license, basically, to let us not pay and use it. And it let us scan real-life objects, which we found very exciting. We thought the QR codes were ugly. We'd seen plenty of demos of augmented reality and thought it looked quite cool, but wanted a different way that we can maybe use it. And so we created a thing that people can download onto their phones, and they can scan the empty windows of the house, and their phone turns into a cinematic camera, or sort of reimagined Rear Window, very, very briefly, as a kind of 6-window sort of short story. But what I really like is when the technology and the work actually become extensions of each other. And so the way that we use the technology or the way that we implement it kind of becomes almost an extension of the metaphor of the work itself. So the inner workings actually carry on through into the platforms that we're using. So Sea of Voices feels on a really practical level like the culmination of a series of sort of techniques and tools for us that we've been sort of messing around with for a while. And I think we feel that this is the best way that we've used them yet to date. And it also seems quite fitting, seeing as we're in glass theory, that we're talking about mobile phones as cultural spaces. But I'm particularly obsessed with the notion of mobile phones, but SMSs in particular, as incredibly intimate, personal bits of communication that we send to each other. And so we designed this work to, in the ideal world, sit on people's mobile phones. So in the ideal world, you can download it as an app, which we designed for both Android and iPhone, which in theory should account for nearly half of the UK's phone-only population. But at the same time, we don't want people to be limited and not being able to access it because of social or economic barriers, so you can also download it as an MP3. But primarily, we want to focus on the notion of people who participate in the piece with their own handsets. So we ran a piece which was all SMS-based in Leeds to begin the year for Opera North. And it was an SMS-based game in the city centre. It was a reimagining of Hamlet's Ophelia. So we retraced the young girl's journey through the streets of the city centre, as she sort of pointlessly roams it at 5 in the morning on a journey towards her death. And we stripped away Hamlet from the story completely and focused instead on a young girl destroyed by the grief of having lost her father. And as participants received messages on their handsets, which was the only way they really needed to engage with the work, they sort of retraced her route, sort of like a noirish kind of forensic investigation, and somewhere between that and sort of concerned friend. And they sent fragments of text and words that they found along the route to her, and she responded back, which kind of led them on a walk all through the city centre. And so all you really needed to participate was enough credit to send 10 SMS text messages and nothing more. But what we really became interested in was the idea that afterwards, so after the event, after you'd got from point A to point Z, was what the piece then became as it sat on your phone, so it was still sat in your inbox as this kind of weird, uncomfortable conversation. And we only really became aware of this as we tested it again and again, and how we started to look back on our drafts in our inbox as an actual structured conversation. And the idea that these things after the event became almost more important than the act of doing the piece in and of itself. And I think a complete byproduct of the work was that the piece became almost entirely about how these digital spaces become emotional ones, and what is left when there's no one else at the other end of the phone number, or what these little specks of data on our hard drive really mean to us on an emotional level, which was not the intended outcome at all, but was by far the most successful thing that the piece did. So we spent a lot of time trying to think about how we can create the best user experience for people in terms of how they can engage with stuff. And again, sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. But we're interested in the idea of people being able to use a device that most of us spend the majority of our time with. So the way most of our lives are structured, I think, sadly, we probably spend more time touching or having these devices at arm's length than we maybe do the people that we love or our partners. And See Your Voice, in a way, is about this. Not entirely, but it's about, there's something in it that is that when you download the app and you take it for a walk, and it's playing out on a device that is yours, you can re-listen to it whenever you want, or you can walk it wherever you want, now or in the future. You don't even have to end the walk or even send a message at the end, but rather it's just yours on your device to own and to do with what you want. There's very little that we can do once you've left the gallery, or you might not even have come to the gallery at all. You download it from the App Store, you bypass us completely, in which case we have no control over your experience whatsoever. But the work does still exist in your ownership. At the end of the walk, you have the opportunity to send a message out to sea. Now how this works is that we use your phone to send a text message, which is sent to our server, which is sat in the gallery, which filters out all the bad stuff that we don't want, like SMS and things that might panic people, and we then send it back to the boy after having kept the message in a database as well for future use. And that all happens in about 70 seconds, and if all is well, you're stood on a breakwater near the end of the walk, and you get a text back telling you that the boy is about to blink your message out. And about 60 seconds later, you should hopefully see the light blink out your message. So, what again happens after the piece, and this was again was a complete byproduct that we didn't think about, is that when you exit the app and you're sat on the bus on the way home, or whatever you're doing afterwards, the message that you've sent now exists in your SMS outbox. So we suddenly became interested because when we did a first test, we didn't have the server connected at the other end, so the message went nowhere. But Vicky had on her phone a text message which someone had picked up the phone, played the app through and sent the message. We had no idea what it was. And we spent ages going, who in the world has sent you this? Why have you received this? Why did you write this? And there was this really bizarre construct that basically the phone takes the message and lets it exist outside of the apps, outside of that really clear frame of the piece. And we suddenly became quite interested in that, in the idea that that sort of metaphorical communication that we talk about in the work of flashing this light that no one can really read out to see doesn't exist in your inbox and kind of the flow of your conversations that day. The single solitary message really then continues to exist afterwards, even if you don't do the work again or if you delete the app. That message could still be hanging around in your inbox without you realising it, which I quite liked, to sneak up and surprise you. So when we first designed the buoy to receive the messages, we came up against the problem really, really quickly. So we wanted to use an actual maritime buoy with an actual maritime buoy light as a 6-mile range. We were going to use an Arduino inside, which is like a little sort of open source hardware platform for people to make things on. And we were going to have 2 radios, one on the shore, one on the sea, and out at sea on the buoy. And there would be a very clear line of communication between the two. They would chat back and forth. And we built it, we got it all working, we got the light flashing surprisingly quickly and painlessly, and we had it all fine. And we decided to move the 2 points further apart than my desk. And it immediately became apparent that it wasn't going to work. It hardly worked down the corridor, let alone the distance that it had to be. And so we had a problem. Thankfully, we solved it really easily. We ended up using a GSM modem, which is basically the guts of a mobile phone strapped to our little computer floating out in the water. And so it's very simple, and the solutions go, it was far more elegant really than the first setup we created, and really crucially it works. But what I really like about the buoy now is that we've sort of untethered it, in the sense that before it existed in a very simple one-point-to-one-point communication. We had a computer on the land, it had a computer out at sea, and they talked, but no one else could intervene in that communication. Now, he basically has a mobile phone, and in theory, any of the 62.5 million mobile phones in the country could send a message to the buoy for it to flash a message out to sea. It's only had 40 so far, but that's a step in the right direction. But suddenly that feels really interesting. It feels like it's a little object floating out at sea on its own, waiting for people to talk to it, rather than something that only we really have control over in a very single channel communication. So the main thing that we often find when we're making work with something like a buoy or a telescope or even a mobile phone is that they're objects that are fundamentally designed for a very practical purpose that often isn't a million miles away from the thing you're using it for. So buoys are used to flash light at sea. They are used to send data back to land. These are all things that exist. It's just that the messages that we're choosing to ask it to send out are giving the object itself sort of a different meaning. And we've kind of reached a point now as a company when we're looking at the technology and the things that we make, where we're sort of looking in depth at our processes. And now the projects for us are growing and the demand and the attention on them is much greater. We've had to ask a lot of things about our ability and how much we can allocate to the development of the technology itself. So we didn't build the app. We asked someone else to do it, we paid someone else to do it. So Victoria made all the artwork and the layout and sort of the interface and spent a lot of time drafting and redrafting and sending them back and forth. But we didn't write a single line of code for the app. It was all done by someone else, and they put it onto the App Store for us, and that was that. And that was the first time that we'd ever done that. It's the first time we'd ever sent out something to someone else to make for us. And it made a lot of sense. It's good that we did that. I dread to think what would have happened if we'd insisted that we try and do it. It would have been horrible. But the process of letting go, for me, was really interesting because I tend to make a lot of the practical, nuts and bolts stuff. And so it was the first time that we let something like that go, something that felt like quite a big part of the piece. And we had to ask a lot of, I had to ask a lot of really interesting questions to myself because I kind of thought it to begin with and I couldn't quite work out why. And there was something about what my relationship had become as an artist using that technology in our process. And there was something about that I almost accidentally found myself behaving like a bit of a gatekeeper because I had this knowledge and I had this very clearly established role in our process in the way that we made things, and it had to flow through me. And it was very interesting that at the same time, when we were making work that was becoming more and more technologically ambitious, there was a risk that and only me really, was losing slightly touch with the fact that we were verging on being at a point where we were producing work that sometimes was being made as a demonstration of technical skill as opposed to what the work was, and I was losing my focus a little bit on why were we using these platforms and these methodologies. And I think that was what has been the most useful thing about us and outsourcing, has been actually remembering the giving that away, and instead of me having to spend months and months and months messing around with Objective-C and doing something quite ugly, we were now able to work and focus on what we wanted it to mean, what we wanted it to say instead, which is very crucial, and I think has quite dramatically shifted the way that we're now looking at technology and how it's embedded in our process. But I did still do the rest of the tech stuff and the coding in the project, and I still find myself adopting what I know, and I'm sure if any of you out there are in any way good people with code, it's probably terrible practice. But I like to embed a little bit of kind of ownership and sort of playfulness in the actual process of making things tick when we make work. And when coding our interactions with objects or with SMS or stuff like that, I like to write codes that is, it's not very, on a technical level it's not very good, but I take a lot of pleasure in writing the stories of the objects and the things they're doing into the code that we tell. And it's partly because it makes it easier for me to look back over it and read it, but I like the idea that it's almost like we're etching the actual meanings that we're trying to give these machines into their inner workings. And so this is an example of the final text message that we sent out for Who is Ophelia, which was all about, that should be a semicolon. So that wouldn't run. But this was the idea, and I like to write long verbose things because it feels that this code that when I once started out learning all this stuff felt really impenetrable, kind of becomes like a sort of very creative act of storytelling, and that no one's going to see it apart from me, and it really is just for the geeks. But I really like the idea of sort of etching this secretly into the objects, and it kind of feels like in some way we're sort of inscribing that emotional meaning into the technology again. And I think there's something in that about